Australia, once upon a time, was completely self-sufficient when it came to oil. The good old days, guys. Now, back in 1985, we were producing more oil than we actually needed. Let that soak in. Even into the early 2000s, Australia could meet almost 98% of its domestic fuel demand. We were resilient, protected, and insulated from global shocks because we had our own supply. That is exactly how a resource-rich economy is supposed to operate. But then something big changed. Fast forward to now, 2026, and Australia has almost completely wiped out its energy independence. We now import close to 90 to 98% of our fuel, and we are down to just 2 refineries keeping the entire country running. So the obvious question is, what on earth happened? How did we wind up here? How does a country that is one of the largest energy exporters in the world end up in a position where it cannot even fuel itself? Where did we go wrong? Hey guys, it's Scott here. Now, this might be hard to hear, but the truth is we did this to ourselves. Imagine being the 3rd largest energy exporter in the world, but at the same time, we've actually got to go, little bowl like this. We've got to go beg to China, beg to Singapore, beg to South Korea, and we've got to beg and suck up to the US just to keep petrol flowing at the pump. Imagine being in a position where the moment global supply chains tighten, your entire system starts to wobble, and then we feel very insecure and we're freaking out. We're seeing all the headlines. That is exactly where we are today. Right now, there are already over 200 petrol stations across Australia running dry. And for the first time in a long time, the problem is not just price, it is availability. And the worst part is this. We could have avoided all of this because where we are today did not just happen overnight. It was not the result of just one government. This has been building for decades with successive governments back to back overlooking the importance of energy self-reliance and making policy decisions that slowly led us here because they're too busy chasing votes and doing all this PR stuff instead of running the country. For years, nobody stress tested our fuel reserves. Nobody stopped to rethink energy policy when the rest of the world began diversifying their supply chains and prioritizing security. And that is exactly why I am making this video, because I want to show you how we got here. What decisions over the last 50 years led to this outcome, why refinery after refinery was shut down, and whether the government ever truly prepared for a worst case scenario like the one we are walking into right now. Before I get into this, you know that I cover economy, policy, what's happening in the government, the property market, your finances, your money every single day so that you can stay ahead of the curve and make the right decisions for the people that you care about. So hit subscribe, hit the bell icon. I do these videos every single day. Make sure you subscribe so that you can stay up to date. Okay, first of all, let's just step back and understand how bad things really have become. You first need to actually look at how strong Australia's position used to be. Now, back in the 1980s, even into the early 2000s, Australia had a functioning, resilient fuel system. We were producing significantly more crude oil than we do today, and we had 8 operational refineries spread across the country, supplying almost all of our domestic fuel needs. Around the turn of the century, we were producing roughly 563,000 barrels of oil per day, and those refineries were supplying close to 98% of the country's petroleum demand. Let's be clear, I'm not saying all that oil came from Australia, I'm saying that we refined it here. If you go even further back, Australia was actually a net exporter of oil when it joined the International Energy Agency in 1979, which tells you how strong our position once was. But what most people do not realize is that this system was never just about economics. The refinery network that Australia built in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s was shaped by the experience of war, when Australia learned very quickly how vulnerable an isolated island nation could be without secure fuel supply. These refineries were not just commercial assets, they were strategic infrastructure designed to protect national resilience. At that time, they worked perfectly for the Australia that existed then. Back then, we had a population of around 10 to 15 million people. Fuel demand was modest, and the refineries were designed to process domestic crude blends for a relatively simple energy system. But while Australia stood still, the rest of the world scaled up. From the 1980s onwards, Asia began building a completely different type of refining system. Countries like South Korea, Singapore did not treat refining as just another industry. They treated it as a national priority and strategically invested in massive, highly automated refinery complexes with deep ports and enormous scale. To put that into perspective, Australia's total fuel demand sits at roughly 1 million barrels per day, while a single refinery in India can process around 1.24 million barrels per day on its own, one refinery, which means one site overseas can match or exceed Australia's entire national requirement. These mega refineries operate with massive economies of scale, where the fixed costs of refining are spread across huge volumes, driving down the cost per litre. Australia's refineries, by comparison, were smaller, older, and far more expensive to operate. On top of that, many of our refineries had shallow ports, which meant they could not receive the largest crude carriers, the same carriers that deliver millions of barrels at a time to the Asian mega refineries. That alone increased costs and made them even less competitive. Then there was the crude mismatch problem. Now, Australia produces high quality light crude, which is more valuable on the global market. So instead of refining it locally, we exported it. In fact, around 96% of our light premium crude gets exported, and then we imported refined fuel back from places like Singapore and South Korea because they could refine it a lot cheaper than what we could do here at home. So what you had was a system where we were exporting our raw resource, shutting down our ability to process it, and then buying it back at global prices. Now, for a while, that seemed to work, and at the time, it seemed smart. However, things started to unravel. Now, Australia did not suddenly lose its refining capacity overnight. This was a slow, decades-long process driven by decisions that looked commercially rational at the time. You really couldn't debate them at the time. The closures began gradually. Western Port shut in 1984, Matraville in 1985, Port Stavic was eventually closed, then Clyde got closed, Canal, Bulwer Island, followed through the 2000s and 2010s. With each closure, the system became more and more dependent on imports. Then came the second wave between 2020 and 2021. Australia lost half of its remaining refining capacity in just months when Kwinana and Altana shut down. Each time a refinery closed, the reasoning was consistent. They were no longer economically viable. They could not compete with cheaper imported fuel produced at massive scale overseas. Australia's refineries faced higher labor costs, higher energy costs, stricter environmental compliance, and aging infrastructure that required constant investment just to stay operational. You have to remember, these heavy industries take billions of dollars to maintain and operate. And the key point to note is that governments on both sides did not step in to stop this, because the prevailing belief was that imports were cheaper, global supply chains were reliable, and the market would provide. In fact, the 2014 Energy White Paper explicitly stated that replacing domestic refining with imported fuel did not pose any meaningful risks to Australia's fuel security. Therefore, refinery closures were treated as business decisions, not strategic losses. And once a refinery is shut and you convert that into an import terminal, that door does not swing both ways very easily. You do not just reopen it when things go bad. The capacity is gone permanently. Think about all of the engineers, all of the skilled workers. These people retire. We don't have the apprentices coming in, the people getting in. It takes years and years of training to run, maintain, and keep these things going. Those people are gone, not to mention the capital. By the time the government realized what was happening, the damage was already done. The collapse accelerated during COVID, and when global fuel demand dropped sharply and refining margins were crushed. For companies that had already been questioning the viability of Australian refineries, this became the final trigger. So the government pivoted, it introduced what was called the Fuel Security Package. This created minimum stock holding requirements and began subsidizing the remaining refineries through payments that run until mid-2027. So you have to understand the remaining refineries would be closed if it was not for government subsidies, which is a taxpayer subsidy. In simple terms, we went from saying the market will handle it to we now have to pay to keep the last two refineries alive. And even that is temporary. Both remaining refineries have the contractual ability to shut down, and if one of them closes, Australia would effectively be relying on a single refinery for the entire country. Now, at the same time, the government modeled worst case scenarios. A 2020 fuel security review looked at what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz was shut. So yes, this was modeled because these problems have been going on in Iran and the Middle East for a very long time. The conclusion was that Australia would likely be fine as long as the disruption lasted less than 6 months and global reserves were released. That assumption now looks extremely optimistic. Then there is the reserve problem. Australia has never met the IEA requirement of holding 90 days of fuel reserves, and today we operate with roughly 30 to 40 days of supply, which is one of the lowest buffers in the developed world. This was a really bad mistake, guys. And by the way, it brings into question our relationship with the US, because maybe if we had a great relationship, we could have been tipped off about this months in advance and giving us time to prepare, but we were caught with our pants down. So this is where we are today. Australia imports the vast majority of its fuel. Around half of that refined fuel comes from Singapore, with large portions coming from South Korea and Malaysia, which means we are heavily dependent on a supply chain that ultimately traces back to the Middle East. We have just 2 refineries left, both dependent on government subsidies that expire in the coming years. And if you're wondering why we're spending all this money on these submarines, it's because, hey, what if someone were to naval blockade Malaysia and Singapore? We couldn't get imports and exports and boats in and out. So yeah, those submarines are a big cost, but for national security, we need them. Now let's get back to oil. We export almost all of our crude oil right now, and we rely on global shipping routes to bring back the fuel we need to run our economy, and the consequences are no longer theoretical. In parts of regional Australia, diesel shortages are already being reported. Farmers are warning about supply risks. Transport operators are under a lot of pressure because fuel is not just a cost, it is the backbone of the entire economy. When diesel becomes scarce, food supply chains start to break down, and that flows directly into higher prices at the supermarket. You may have actually seen the memes going around. This is like Mad Max playing out in real life. One of my favorite movies, by the way. So now the real question is not just how we got here. The real question is, knowing what we know today, would you have made the same decisions? Well, the answer is clearly no. Do you think we should have closed our refineries, or should we have found a way to upscale our refineries to ensure self-reliance? Let me know in the comments. I generally want to know. This was your daily property update. Now, I talk about property. I talk about investing into property so that you can make the right decisions at the right times. And just remember, guys, Australia is interlinked with what happens in the world globally. Thousands of miles away, what is happening there affects us here at home. We've got to look at what's happening globally, locally, in the economy, governments, government policy. All of this must be covered if you want these updates every single day so that you can make smart, strategic decisions for yourself and the people you care about. Make sure to hit subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next video.